Um, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. My name is Imran Ali Malik. I'm the executive director of Falah Center. It's our great honor to invite Imam Nihal Khan back to the place where he grew up. He grew up here in Bedminster. Born. You're born here. Born. Yeah, where your head hit the ground, as the Arabs say, right? Yeah. MashaAllah. So, Imam Nihal Khan, just to give a formal biography, he's the founder of Maktab Academy and is completing a PhD in Islamic Studies at Ibn Khaldun University in Istanbul, Turkey. He teaches Arabic at Fawakih Institute and hosts the Faith in Fine Print podcast. Also, you might have seen him on Celebrate Mercy broadcasts during Ramadan especially, recites a juz every night, and there's a conversation late into the night with many scholars. It's a beautiful thing. Along with his master's in Islamic Studies from the Hartford Seminary, an Alamiya degree in Islamic Law and Theology from Nadwat al-Ulama in Lucknow, India, and a BA in Psychology from Montclair State University. Nihal has also studied at the Harvard Divinity School and at the Mahad Dar al-Funun. Most recently, Nihal was the Director of Religious Affairs at the Islamic Center of Connecticut, a chaplain at St. Francis Hospital, and an imam at West Cobb Islamic Center in Marietta, Georgia. He lives with his wife currently in Istanbul, Turkey, and he's visiting us this summer. Inshallah, the talk tonight is titled Knowledge and the Challenge of Community. Imam Nihal will start with some formal remarks, and then we'll get into a discussion after that, inshallah.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah wa salatu wa salamu ala Rasulillah wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'een. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Good to be back, alhamdulillah. I know we were here this morning. The part of this program that we wanted to indulge in is going to require somewhat of a conversation. So I'm going to speak just for a little bit, and then I'm going to have Imran go ahead and interrogate me and scrutinize me. And then from there, we were hoping to engage the community. What I did want to speak to everyone about was more so a reflection about how knowledge should be something that is transformational, how knowledge should be something that is inspirational. And more so, within our communities, reprogramming our minds to accept and understand terminology in a way which may be different than how we have grown up with it. So for example, there may be terms that me and you are used to hearing, but when we do not tend to really go into the depth of what those terms mean, we tend to not be able to get to the root of practice and understanding within our faith. So for example, there's a term that many of us are familiar with. It's called dhikr. We've all heard of this term. And we tend to think that the term dhikr is in reference to merely remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, saying subhanallah, saying alhamdulillah, saying Allahu Akbar. And we tend to think that's the only form that me and you are going to be familiar with. But in essence, when we understand dhikr holistically, it should be something that changes the way by which we engage the world around us. Dhikr more so is a state of being than it is an action that we do very disparately. True dhikr, true embodiment of understanding where I am, who I am, what am I here to do, will cerebrally reprogram how I view the world. That's what the actual power of dhikr should be. So when we read verses in the Quran which say, "Ala bi dhikrillahi tatma'innul qulub," Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying that, alas, by the remembrance of Allah, the hearts become tranquil. But if you hear the way this verse is being said in the Quran, it's being said in an irregular manner. Why do I say that? Because nobody says, for example, nobody will say, it's red, the sky, because the sky is the subject, and the predicate is what? Red. So here, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is doing the same exact thing. Because when I'm saying it's red, my emphasis is not on the fact that everyone should look up at the sky, but my emphasis is on what instead? My emphasis is on the fact that the sky has become red. Thank you so much to Canadian wildfires, right? Because my speech is pointing exactly to that. There is an emphasis on the words, showcasing that there's a meaning that would not be able to be understood except by my understanding of the context of the speech. Now, in the Quran, when Allah is saying, by the dhikr of Allah, the hearts become tranquil, we need to focus not just on the hearts becoming tranquil, but on the actual aspect of dhikr, on the actual aspect of remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this idea of remembrance within our communities is what we are all seeking. We live in a society that thrives off of disassociation. We seek to disassociate and live life in very clean binaries. So people will enter the masjid, for example, and they'll put on a very different personality than who they are outside of the masjid. So we begin to draw this really interesting pre-modern idea of deen and dunya. We begin to craft knowledge into deen and dunya. And this isn't here to belabor the point of Deeni sciences and dunyawi sciences. But when we make such comparisons, or rather such bifurcations, such divisions, we have underlying assumptions around that. We have underlying assumptions about the knowledge that we are gaining and saying that one of these things has nothing to do with recognizing the grand architect of the universe, the creator of the universe, Allah. And the other one, it's something that helps us understand the world around us. But in reality, that's as much connected to God consciousness and a God-centered society than any of the other sciences. When you look at, for example, algebra. Algebra was what? A deductive science, which we now understand, developed and brought into fruition by Muslims to do what? Mathematically comprehend the world around us. Al-Khwarizmi, Al-Haythami, astronomers, mathematicians, all these people studied the world not to just Islamize it, but to do what? But to construct a worldview that was very much so God-centric. To construct a worldview that was very much so in line with understanding who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is as my Lord, as my Creator, and as my Sustainer. So when I begin to understand this, when I begin to understand that the approach to spirituality that I need to be working towards is one rooted in consistency, then once again, the way by which I approach the universe, the way by which I approach community begins to change. When we understand that the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he told us, خَيْرُ الْأَعْمَالِ إِلَى اللَّهِ إِنْ قَلَّ وَأَدْوَمُهَا, that the best of actions are those which are what? The ones you do as a grand gesture, the ones you do and you post online and everyone is really happy by the fact that you did something. No, the best of actions are those which are small and they are consistent. They are those things which you do regularly and you have established in your life. And when we tend to talk about community, when we tend to talk about unity, all of these words have become nothing more than catchphrases if and when we do not have any element of spiritual purification, of practical spirituality within our own lives as individuals. So now we begin to construct on one end a Islamic understanding rooted in just praying or just being in the masjid. Or we are on the other end of the spectrum wherein the Islam that we have or we use is very much so utilitarian and we do nothing with it except to push back against political trends in the community in an un-Islamic manner, one which will only serve us in our generation, and it won't do anything for the generation to come. So when we talk about knowledge, we have to keep this in mind. Why are we studying the things that we study? Not just religion, but anything. why am I going to learn something? What is this knowledge supposed to do? Because many of us, as I mentioned earlier, we're being taught to study for the sake of what? For the sake of earning, for the mere sake of having a job. So the learning that we're doing is not intended to make us necessarily better humans. And if the intention is not there to make us better humans, then that intention is going to be for something else. It's a principle of usul al-fiqh, al-umuru bimaqasidiha, that matters that we engage in are dependent by the intention that we make. Or in the hadith of the Messenger sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ وَإِنَّمَا لِكُلِّ امْرِئٍ مَّا نَوَى فَمَنْ كَانَتْ هِجْرَتُهُ إِلَى اللَّهِ وَرَسُولِهِ فَهِجْرَتُهُ إِلَى اللَّهِ وَرَسُولِهِ. Meaning what? That when we intend to do something, then that's going to be the outcome. But if we do not make an intention, and something happens because of the fact of tasadufan, that they say, it just coincidentally, then there is no guarantee that we'll be able to replicate and scale the good of our actions when we haven't really comprehended the intentions behind them. We have not observed the trends that arise out of the things that we begin to institute as community policy, whether that's through a literal affirmation of it or through creating a culture which is unquestionable. So knowledge is something whose genealogy we have to question. If I say I'm going to make a masjid is a place to pray. It comes from the Arabic word of a place of making sajda. In the Prophet ﷺ's time, it wasn't just a place where you would pray. That was the bare minimum utility of it, but it was much more. It was a place of also referred to as a jami'. In Turkey, they refer to, anytime you see people like, what's a cami? It's C-A-M-I, but it's actually in Turkish, the C is a J. But a jami' literally comes from the word of jama'a, where people come together, they gather together, and they bring themselves together. But that togetherness has to be rooted in a common understanding. That togetherness has to be rooted, no matter how different we are, with one form of a theological common denominator. That has to be rooted in knowledge, which works to be transformative, where it cerebrally reprograms us. In the Quran, in Surah Al-Ra'd, Allah says, إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يُغَيِّرُ مَا بِقَوْمٍ or لَا يُغَيِّرُ مَا بِقَوْمٍ حَتَّى يُغَيِّرُ مَا بِأَنفُسِهِمْ. Allah does not change the state of a people until they begin to change themselves. And we tend to think that this only refers to the bad to the good. But very much so as well, it can refer to the good to the bad. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will not take us from a good state to a bad state, except what? ظَهَرَ الْفَسَادُ فِي الْبَرِّ وَالْبَحْرِ بِمَا كَسَبَتْ أَيْدِ النَّاسِ. Wherein we choose to change that state from good to bad or from bad to good. That's why it's important for us to ask ourselves, the knowledge that we dissipate, are we merely giving it as a platitude? Are we merely giving it because it sounds nice in the khutbah? Or are we examining this knowledge so that it benefits? Why is it that at Salat al-Fajr, and it's after Salat al-Asr, or rather after Salat al-Fajr, the Messenger sallallahu alayhi wa sallam used to recite which dua? Allahumma inni as'aluka ilman nafi'a. That, oh Allah, give me beneficial knowledge. Wa rizqan tayyiba. And give me what? A pure sustenance. Wa amalan mutaqabbala. And actions which are accepted. So it's a triage. This triage of knowledge that is beneficial, of provision of a livelihood that is pure, and actions which are accepted are all coming together. So the genealogy of knowledge as procured to us by our faith showcases what? Showcases that good knowledge leads to a pure being and a pure sustenance and a pure career, which then allows actions to be beneficial. Not just amalan mutaqabbala fil akhirah, not just in the hereafter, but also the actions and trends, the positive trends that we set forth in our community, the culture we put into place, which cannot just be changed in one shot. All of that tends to lie down on what? It tends to lie on the fabric of this triage. So that's how knowledge comes to be. That's how knowledge is understood in the context of community. And that's why we do not just take a wholesale of knowledge as it comes in. We examine what works, we examine what does not work. We examine that which is true, we examine that which is not true. Today in the Surah Al-Hujurat class, we went over the verse, يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا إِنْ جَاءَكُمْ فَاسِقٌ بِنَبَإٍ فَتَبَيَّنُوا. And in another qira'ah, فَتَثَبَّتُوا. That when knowledge comes to you of something, you verify it. You verify it. تَبَيَّنُوا. You make it clear what is there, what isn't there. And then through that, we proliferate such knowledge into our communities. So that's what I was hoping to reflect upon today. What we can now do is, Imran, you're more than welcome to, inshallah, engage me on this. And then from there, what we'll do is we'll open it up for Q&A, inshallah.
Bismillah. So, yeah, we had a wonderful class this morning on community constitution, you called it. The tafsir of Surah Hujurat and a Quranic ethic that's derived from the surah about how to conduct ourselves in community. And that was it's something that we can use to start to ask ourselves, how are we going to build community? But I wanted to get into maybe during this time, maybe a more practical application for both the average Muslim as well as the leadership of the Imam class and of the people who are making organizations and masajid. We are also a very new community. And so getting into that, there are some very practical things about how we should treat one another, practical things that how we should treat others. So we are a minority in this larger community, but we're also a very diverse community. And in that, there's some natural friction that occurs between class, between different race, between different generations even of people trying to do work. So just wanted to get your thoughts on the very practical, what are the very practical things that we should be thinking about as we try to build community in this context versus some other context in another time in Islamic history or civilization.
Yeah, I think that's a good point to bring up. I think a good space to always focus on is conflict, because people tend to either be conflict prone or they tend to be conflict averse. It's usually one of those two. For example, I'm somebody that is conflict averse. So if I don't have to confront someone or something, I don't do it because of the fact that sometimes it's not worth it. But at times, you want to take the bull by its horns. And sometimes you need to see where this goes, meaning what? There has to be a natural progression to teach people how to hold on to that conflict. So don't push conflict away. Don't welcome it. But what we can do is understand how each person resolves conflict. And today in the Surah Al-Hujurat class, that's what we were talking about, is there's a general overture of teaching people to speak to each other and not at each other. As I mentioned, right, وَإِن طَائِفَتَانِ مِنَ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ وَإِن طَائِفَتَانِ مِنَ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ اقْتَتَلُوا فَأَصْلِحُوا بَيْنَهُمَا. That if two groups from the believers begin fighting. So already both of those groups are acknowledged from within the believing community. Meaning what? A standard is set showcasing that fights happen. Conflicts occur. But at the same time, showcasing that when a conflict occurs, we need to learn to talk through it as opposed to be avoidant of it, or opposed to be that how dare someone criticizes someone else. So I think that's the first thing to look at. I think it's really important to bring into conversation, because a lot of folks may not be aware of how to actually handle conflict. So taking a step back, I know we spoke about families today. So there's, in chaplaincy training, they teach us about how families come in together. So there are interpersonal there are theories of interpersonal family relationships. So there's one theory known as Bowen's method. And in Bowen's methods, he goes over how communities, specifically of families, of nuclear families, can learn to navigate conflict. So for example, There's the idea of enmeshment, right? Enmeshment is the idea where we have no emotional boundaries. I think I can say whatever I want, however I want about you, and you can do the same thing to me. And I may not possess the ability to tell you that I don't appreciate that, or you don't have the ability to tell me as such. Hence, it boils and boils and boils until it leads into an outburst. Or we look at methods of understanding that there are boundaries that we need to create amongst people, not when things are bad, but also just understand that, let's say somebody is older or somebody is younger, how do we treat them? So either, and this is, I think, an issue with the community as well, not just this community, but in general, people will overly revere those that are elders and then show absolutely no respect to those people that are younger. For example, now, those are two completely different extremes. And at the same time, the Messenger ﷺ, he said, مَنْ لَمْ يُوَقَّرْ كَبِيرَنَا وَيَرْحَمْ صَغِيرَنَا فَلَيْسَ مِنَّا. That whosoever does not show reverence to those that are older, and they do not show mercy to those that are younger, they are not of this community. So it goes both ways, and it's important to understand that the boundaries that we talk about as a family are subjective. Each family has a different situation. But understanding how we are going to mitigate those things, say for example, between spouses, a boundary could be something like talking about finances. How is it that we're going to take care of the home? If you earn and I earn, how are we separating the money? But we tend to not have those conversations amongst our actual families. And again, the community is reflective of all of us as a joint unit. So if we aren't engaging in those conversations of what does conflict look like? What does healthy conflict look like? What does healthy communication look like? Am I talking at someone or am I talking to someone? I think in that scenario, you can begin to understand the culture of conflict in communities in that sense.
Love to get into that a little bit more about what does healthy conflict look like? How can we build that into our lives in terms of whether it's setting a boundary or it's, somebody went too far and they said something they shouldn't have, and that we know that the Muslim is the one who's safe from the other Muslims' words and hands. So let's say someone crosses that boundary. What then should be the approach by the person who is aggrieved, or for those who are witnessing that harm? What should they do?
I think when it comes to resolving issues, the first thing to be able to do is understand yourself. What is it that you're feeling? I think people tend to react in a way which, in the first instance they get hit, for example. Like even in boxing, right? If you get hit and you don't take time to keep yourself away from getting hit the second time, you're going to get hit a third time, a fourth time, a fifth time, a sixth time. But if in the first hit you take a step back and you just try to hold off and not just throw a punch back, I think that's going to be the first step, is we begin to control what in Arabic they'd call your bawadir, like these inclinations that we have to just snap back, right? And we all have that, to say that nasty thing back or to hurl an insult back. But fire does not put out fire. Right? And somebody has to kind of take a step back, recollect, let things calm down, and then find a way to communicate to this person about how maybe what was said was hurtful, what was conveyed was something that felt disrespectful. And then being able to convey that is the first thing. The second element comes in for the person who is being told this to receive it, to understand it. You don't have to agree with it, but you merely acknowledge this person's pain. It goes so far. So conflict also is not necessarily adversarial. You can have a conflict of emotions in your heart when somebody passes away, when you're going through a difficult time period. And even within the prophetic literature, within the hadith, for example, there is the story of Umayr radiallahu anhu, whose bird passed away. And when his bird passed away, think about this, the beauty of giving condolences. His bird passed away, and the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam went to give him condolences about his bird passing away. And he came up to him, and he said, Ya Aba Umayr, ma fa'ala an-nughayr. So he had this like word play. with Umair and Nughair, and his bird had passed away. And he went and he showed this sense of compassion, this sense of mercy, this sense of giving tasalli, which is in Arabic and an Urdu word. He provided condolences to this person. So that conflict of emotion that occurred at the sight of loss, he spoke to it. There may be a conflict of emotion that occurs when we are angry. What is that conflict of emotion? Is that you don't want this feeling that you're having lead you to do something that will be irrational and not healthy. So it's going to be a trial and error, but at the same time, becoming a community that is very much so aware of how to name their emotions is something very important, wherein we begin to feel very deeply and understand what it is that we're feeling and begin to speak to those emotions at an individual level. Once we've done that, then there's the second aspect, is to be able to convey to somebody else what it is that they're feeling, as we went over, but for that person to be receptive and just understand where the other person is coming from. Now, all of that is going to be very difficult to do if there is just going to be an underlying amount of enmity between people, where you legitimately don't like somebody, wherein you have tried to make things right with this person, and it's just not going anywhere. Wherein at that point, you say salam, and sometimes different personalities, they don't get along. It's a hadith of the Messenger, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He said that al-arwahu, right? That souls are like soldiers that have been sent ahead in an army. Al-arwahu junudun mujannada. And there are those souls that sometimes ikhtalaf, they just can't get along, and there are certain souls who do what? I'talaf. Right? It comes from ulfa, right? To come together. So sometimes it's okay to acknowledge that I have a personality that may be a little bit hot or cold in comparison to someone else. And sometimes acknowledging that we're just two different people with two different views is going to be the best response to certain conflicts. That's just the truth of it. Like if you try with certain people, family members, certain situations of friends even maybe, where that person cannot see where you're coming from, but they also are not able to control the way they react to your thoughts or your ideas, and you have the same thing. Like we all have that one person in our lives, or more than one person, who we see the world very differently than them, and we can't get them to see the world in the way we would like them to see the world. And we just kind of take a step back and understand they're just different personalities. When you look at the companions, for example, in Surah Al-Hujurat today, we spoke about the conflict that occurred between Abu Bakr radiallahu anh and Umar radiallahu anh. They raised their voices in the presence of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. What was that? Was it that they didn't like each other? No, we know that the literature teaches us that they were two completely different people. Abu Bakr radiallahu anh was more calm, he was more coy, he was more collected. Umar radiallahu anh could not stand when somebody's rights were being trampled over. He couldn't stand when the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam was being taken advantage of. So I think it's going to be a continuous amount of exploration and beginning to understand the types of people that exist in our community, and understanding that we need to have a path to resolving conflict, a path. There's a reason companies, for example, have like human resource departments. Right? What's the point of a human resource department? The point is for them to mitigate situations where humans are involved in their relationships with this company, with their employees. Now, do masajid need a full-blown HR department? Maybe if you're like a giant, mega center somewhere in the south. But we need to also understand that having leaders that we can go to who are actually trained in this art is really important. People like Imam Sahib Sultan, like that was something that he was trained in, right? I remember for myself, I would go into a hospital for 1 year, and we would merely listen to patients so that they can get these ideas off their chest so that they can rest better. I remember I would spend time in the cardiovascular ward, like where people had heart problems. I am not making this up. Every person that had heart problems that spoke to me as a chaplain was just really suffering from unresolved conflict with friends and family. And how that has a psychosomatic connection with the way your body functions. So I think it's always important to let people know what it is that you're feeling. And then from there, whatever their reaction is their reaction, positive or negative. And because of the fact that we haven't taught people how to deal with conflict, either people will be very rough or they'll just, let it boil over. I think it's important to have a space for people to come together and speak about the things that are their grievances. I think even, as I mentioned, when I was an imam up in Connecticut, lectures I realized wasn't helping the community grow. There's a space for that. But when people are coming to a event, they need to be given the ability to talk about things that may be bothering them. When the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and think about this, we think sometimes that we're a very prophetic community, but some of the things that the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam did consistently with his community, for whatever reason we don't do it. For example, after Fajr, the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam would ask the companions about the dreams that they'd have, and he'd interpret the dreams for them. And we know that within even modern literature on how people understand dreams, much of what our dreams are representative of, as one hadith tells us, it's just something from shaitan, or it's a glad tiding, or it's a recollection of what's been going on in your life. That middle category is where the majority of dreams come down to. So the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam was using dream interpretation to tell companions about how they can better navigate their lives. What are we doing to basically help people navigate those things that are troubling to them? Now, I don't want to sound like a soapbox. On the other end of the situation, do we make resources available to people to live a more holistic life, wherein they are able to get better, they're able to engage in more communal discussion and grow from that?
Thank you. Yeah, you put forth a lot of ideas there. Let me bring it down to the personal for you. Because you said you're conflict averse. So you know this about yourself, right? And I would contend that most of us are conflict averse. We live in a time where we are very individualistic because of the way that we are raised in the society to want certain things. There's lots of comfort in our lives. Yeah. There's even hadith about people coming to mosques on couches, which I can only imagine are like our cars. Like, we live in a very uniquely comfort-driven time. So I think a lot of us are conflict averse.
I just had to think about a couch rolling up with like Michelin tires on it, and then I realized you're talking about like a Bentley or something like that.
Right. So I think about that as like,
I'm like, what is going on in Bridgewater?
Alhamdulillah. I think, but then there's others who are naturally combative. So then in a state like that, where there are some who are willing to go much harder on people than others, most people will back off. And so for you, if you were in a situation like this, where you're witnessing some kind of harm being done or some kind of unjust thing being said, how do you handle that?
I think the first thing that it comes down to, and I'll speak about it in two ways. One of the things that I have actively been working on, because of the fact, as working as an imam, is actually to become a bit more comfortable with conflict. So if a question arises, or like I remember at one gathering, somebody was like really concerned about something that I said, they're grilling me about it. And people were getting really uncomfortable about it. I said, no. Like, these aren't spaces for us to have feel-good conversations. These are spaces for us to feel very real and talk about things that we find problematic or we need to address. So I think people that are less prone to conflict should should find venues to look at healthy conflict, right? To find healthy venues to address it. And I think a lot of professional settings do this too. So they'll train employees as to how to look at conflict, get through it, and address it. Versus if I'm somebody that is more prone to wanting to be combative, everything, I'm just ready to be a contrarian, right? That's the other aspect of it, right? You ever hear somebody who is offering you nothing except contradictions? They're just there to contradict you. They raise their kids in this manner too. They just want to contradict everybody. It's one of the most unhealthy things you can do for someone. That's the type of person, for them to become better at that, they perhaps need to just hold their tongue a little bit more, right? Silence in the face of oppression is oppression in and of itself, but also understanding that you need to put things in their places. You know, the word dhulm, oppression, according to Arabic linguists, they classify it as وَضْعُ الشَّيْء فِي غَيْرِ مَحَلِّهِ. So placing something where it does not belong. So, for example, when you come into the masjid and folks just throw their shoes on the ground, right, and they double park their cars, it's actually like a minor form of dhulm. You should actually use that, in the next like Jummah announcement or something. Like you're doing dhulm, right? At the same time, it is. You're inconveniencing people. You're harming them. So when we engage in this form of placing things where they do not belong, saying things at times where it is inappropriate, doing things at times which is inappropriate, is something that needs to be called out. For example, is laughing bad? In essence, it's not, right? But if you go to a funeral and you're laughing your head off at the graveyard, do you think that that is something that is appropriate? You do? Oh, okay. It's like, but on the other hand, say you are somebody that is sad. Is being sad wrong per se? Is crying a problematic thing? No. But if I'm going, say, to a wedding, and all I talk about is death and dying and losing our loved ones, is that the most appropriate place to have that conversation? Some of you are like, of course. Right? But it's not. وَضْعُ الشَّيْءِ فِي مَحَلِّهِ وَضْعُ الشَّيْء فِي غَيْرِ مَحَلِّهِ. That's what the Messenger ﷺ understood. He was the mastercraft of emotional intelligence. He understood who to say and what to say it, when to say it, and that's literally what I've been talking about, the study of words and the application of words. So yeah.
So I want to talk about the possibility of community being, we've talked about some of the harm, but let's talk about the opportunity. So, as the Prophet ﷺ taught us, al-mu'min mira'atul mu'min, that the believer is the mirror of the believer. So in essence, if we want to better ourselves, the eye cannot see itself. I need you to see myself. I want to talk a little bit about that, about how we can use each other to grow in spiritual brotherhood and in ourselves, how we kind of use these relationships in a way to approach Allah ultimately through long-term kind of communal relationships, if you will.
Yeah. So how do we grow as a community? I think the one hadith which I learned very long time ago was the famous hadith of Abdullah ibn Salam, where when the Messenger ﷺ entered Medina and they were welcoming him, right? They were singing طَلَعَ الْبَدْرُ عَلَيْنَا and all that. It's a beautiful story. One of the companions, he comes to the Messenger ﷺ, and the first advice that the Messenger ﷺ said, أَفْشُ السَّلَامِ, spread the salam. Now, why is this important? This is important because we tend to only say salam to people who we know. And believe it or not, this has been cited within our tradition as a sign of the Day of Judgment, when people will only say salam to those or greet those that they know. And that's becoming a lost art. But it's important for us to say salam to people whether we know them or not. So afshu salam. Number 2, وَطْعِمُ الطَّعَامِ. We do this one really well, right? Feeding people. Feeding people. You guys ever heard the story of this guy from, I think it was Indiana, the guy who went to bomb the masjid, but then they invited him inside, and he was all over. He was on John Bernthal's podcast. I forgot his name.
I haven't heard.
I'm sorry? Richard McKinney. Yeah, Richard McKinney. So he was this Navy guy who literally went into a masjid to scout it out to bomb it. And instead he went in and they had really good food, and he ended up converting to Islam, eventually becoming the president of the masjid.
Wow, that must have been some great biryani.
I'm telling you, barakabiryani.com. And I'm just making that. I don't know if that's what it was. But food brings people together. And I used to think this is kind of funny, but this is the one beauty of Muslim cultures and countries, no matter where you go, is the idea of feeding people. I remember, I think it was Finland or Sweden, they said that if they invite people over, they don't feed them and they'll eat, and they don't expect to feed their own guests. right? Ridiculous idea. Of course, people are not going to take you seriously. Of course, there's not going to be a sense of love. So the aspect of feeding people. أفشوا السلام وطعموا الطعام, right? وصل الأرحام. Connecting with people. Connecting people that have been cut off from each other. Now that's a hard one because sometimes connecting with people is not a one-time effort. It takes 2 efforts, 3 efforts, 4 efforts. And people think that that waslul arham, connecting people that are related, requires you to call them every single day. And that qat'ur rahim is that you don't call people every single day. But think about this. We live in a time that people have phones and they message each other. If somebody is becoming difficult to talk to over text or they're becoming difficult to talk to over phone, but you have no problem meeting with them whenever you go to see them, and you're maintaining a healthy boundary with them, and you've tried to resolve conflict with them but it doesn't work, I don't see there being necessarily an issue with it. But at the same time, we need to be more focused on connecting with people than disconnecting from them. Then the fourth aspect, وَصَلُّوا وَالنَّاسُ بِالنِّيَامِ. Here the Messenger ﷺ is teaching us to have a connection of piety with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is not for the public, wherein we are consistently working on ourselves because of the fact that community is only good as the individual unit that makes it up. For example, when we talk about this carpet, there's little fibers in it. And the strength and comfort of these little fibers makes up what? That's what makes up this being like a comfortable carpet. Similarly, a good community is only made up of people that are connected to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in their own individual worship. So, and then he says at the end, تَدْخُلُ الْجَنَّةَ بِسَلَامٍ. You will enter paradise in peace in this manner.
I'd like to ask one more thing before we open it up to questions, inshallah. So start thinking of good questions and comments. But you said something very interesting to me during the session this morning, which was a technical definition that you gave for taqwa. And we know that the Jummah khutbah, for example, the purpose of it is to remind people to have taqwa. But the definition that you gave is to guard oneself against harm. Which is interesting because mostly we hear it as God consciousness. So in this context, the context of this conversation, how does communal relations with one another, how can we use those to increase ourselves in taqwa? As we guard ourselves from harm, maybe by setting boundaries, maybe by having constructive conflict. I just thought maybe you could reflect on that a little bit. And then how a community grows in taqwa. And then that community becomes a God-conscious community calling all of the people to Islam and to Allah.
So taqwa, I think, has, as you mentioned, a technical idea to it, but it also has a holistic idea to it, hence the definition. Even Sheikh Hamza Yusuf has brought this up, and other scholars have mentioned it, that it's that shield that stops other things from penetrating you and harming you. And the thing to keep in mind is keeping our peace. But taqwa, at the end of the day, when it comes to the community, we know that each person has rights due upon each other. So, yesterday I had mentioned that we tend to only be good to those that we know. We only say salam to those people that we know. Here's another element to it. In Surah An-Nisa, Allah says, وَاعْبُدُوا اللَّهَ وَلَا تُشْرِكُوا بِهِ شَيْئًا وَبِالْوَالِدَيْنِ إِحْسَانًا. So, worship Allah and be good to your parents. But the verse goes on, and it actually talks about being good to those people, وَالصَّاحِبِ بِالْجَنْبِ وَبَنِ السَّبِيلِ. Being good to صاحب الجنب, the person that is to your side, the person that is next to you. To being good to them who can't do anything for you. That's the person at the grocery store. That's the person standing in front of you in line to get coffee. That's the person on the street who you're driving next to. Each one of those people, just because I may not have a connection to them, still guarantees rights to be fulfilled towards them, to be good to them. Similarly, I know we didn't get to it today. I said sahib bil jamb, right? Janaba. In Surah Al-Hujurat, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu ijtanibu kathiran min adh-dhann. So here, Allah is saying that believers resist or stop yourself from having assumptions about people. Similarly here, why is it that we're being told that? Because there may be a piece of information that is coming so close to us, we have proximity to it, but it's unverified, therefore we should not accept it. But there is this desire to accept it because of, oh, everyone's saying it, everyone's doing it. My point in mentioning all of this is that we tend to conflate the idea of huququllah and huququl ibad, the idea of rights that are due upon God and rights that are due upon people. When we talk about our rights that are due upon Allah, that is separate from our rights that are due upon people. That's why when we commit a wrong against someone, we are required by the Sharia to make right with them. We are required by our deen, by the tenets set forth by God, to do right by people in the best way possible. So hence, when we tend to fulfill this criteria of huququllah, but tend to not fulfill the criteria of huququl ibad, we're not practicing holistic taqwa at all. Because that's one element, if it's lacking, it's not going to build community. If I don't trust you, if I don't see you as a respectable person, you don't see me as a respectable individual, you don't try to understand my perspectives, I don't try to understand your perspectives, and we don't talk about anything that's truly engaging, we're not going to really grow. You know, sometimes you go to places and people don't have real conversations. And, you know, this happened when I left Jersey and then I came back. There are a lot of folks who you realize you may have known for a while, but those are just relationships that are there, which you can respect that person, but you cannot get into an intimately deep understanding of who this individual is. While we may not do that with every single person there, we should engage with each other. We should know what problems are concerning the other person around us. The Messenger ﷺ says what about neighbors, for example? Neighbors are a part of our communities. When your neighbor is going to sleep on an empty stomach, Allah subhanahu, or the Messenger ﷺ said that we are responsible to help and feed that person. But if we don't know, we don't engage in conversation, it's a dog-eat-dog world. Of course you're not going to be able to get to know each other. And I think that's where taqwa becomes associated with the rights that are due upon people, wherein we consistently engage with our fellow friends and family in difficulties and in ease.
Bismillah. At any time now, questions, comments, practical, philosophical thoughts? Anyone? I can keep going.
Yeah.
Assalamu alaikum. So one of the things I think you did mention that in a masjid, I guess in your previous experiences, there's a lot of times, you know, the only programs we have is basically lectures. So besides the salat, you know, what would you propose to bring the community together? So it's not just interaction, but as a group, something is done together.
Yeah. I think communities tend to be very big spaces. So whether it's events that are like this, right? And I think beforehand we had like food. So people get to speak to each other in very informal settings. One thing that I used to do when I was in Connecticut, we had a program called Chai Chats, where it wasn't that many people. Like this is a lot of people in comparison. It would be like 7 to 10 people. And in a very informal manner, we would have tea. And then after the tea, we'd just have Q&A about whatever was bothering people or whatever they wanted to know about. But it's going to be different for each community, right? Not, for example, maybe in certain communities, people will get together and have, for example, in many Arab communities, they have an aza when people pass away to console people. That may not necessarily be in a situation in other forms of community. So it depends on each community that we're able to come together, not just in happy moments, but also in sad moments, also in moments where we don't understand each other. and consistently to respect the space that we're in, which is the masjid, and learn to work through these issues. I remember Imam Suhaib Webb at ISBCC in Boston. He had a program at a masjid in which people, when they first put it together, thought nobody's going to come to. That was a Alcoholics Anonymous program for the Muslim community. So they said that there would be a consistent 15 to 20 people that would come every single week who had problems with drinking alcohol in the Muslim community. And things of that nature where you're doing something that generally people will think doesn't exist, but it's providing an outlet. It's allowing people to recover from something that difficult in their life that they know is not right, but they're working through. All of these situations, for example, even like Quran schools, right? An adults Quran program, things that you can do regularly as community members, and you can grow and be open about and learn, and we take seriously. So that's what it comes down to, is asking ourselves that what is it that we want to do? And not only that, as a community, it's important to know what direction we want to take our center, what direction we want to take our community, and what are going to be the factors that we need to bring into conversation to do that. So that Alcohol is Anonymous thing is one aspect. Another aspect in my community in Connecticut we would do programs like this, and we started off with this many people. Connecticut, I like to say that it's a big pond, or it's a small pond with a bunch of, with a few big fish. I think in places like New Jersey, it's a big pond with a bunch of small fish. But we started off with maybe 15, 20 people at these programs, wherein every month, religiously, we would bring a speaker, and I would be where Imran is, and I would basically engage with the speaker and get them talking, and then get the community in. And I can be a little provocative. So I would say things that would be just ridiculous just to get the community working. I'd be like, yeah, but a little bit of fighting is good for the soul, Right? Things like that, just to get people going. Because sometimes people are also very uncomfortable to speak out or to really engage.
Assalamu alaikum. So bringing it back to Surah Hujurat, I was just thinking about something I'd be curious on your insight. So I feel like sometimes when people read these verses and it's all about adab, they think about somebody. They don't think about themselves. They think about someone else and oh, this is a perfect example of that person having bad adab, and just kind of how can we read these verses in a way that's more introspective and what does our faith kind of teach about when we see faults, this concept of a mirror? How do we see faults in ourselves? How do we improve on turning that inwards when we're in community? Because I think something that happens in community is you see a lot of faults around. But what we know about growing spiritually is that can be a big distraction. So how can we just use the community as an opportunity to grow spiritually and not, be distracted by faults?
So I think all of us, كل بني آدم خطاء وخير الخطائين التوابون. That the Messenger ﷺ, he said that every single son of Adam is a sinner. Every single son of Adam makes mistakes. And the best of those that make mistakes are those that repent, that find a path to coming away from that destruction, coming away from the harm that we do, and growing with it. I think often people tend to be very concerned with what other people are up to, what other people are doing, and we mine that information religiously. One thing that I think we tend to do is to be very connected, which makes us live life in a way where we're living through other people's experiences. So things become very much so detached from who we are as individuals. But I think bringing back individual accountability will, at least within our tradition, you have the idea, for example, of salah. What's the point of salah? The point of salah is for me to connect with my Creator in a way where I'm having spiritual accountability with the one that created me. Where in my dua, when I engage in dua with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, I understand the meaning of Allahumma inni zalamtu nafsi, that, oh Allah, I have sinned against myself. I have oppressed myself. Dhulman kathira. But at the same time, not beating myself over it. Not making myself despondent about the things that I may not do. La taqnatu min rahmatillah. Do not find yourself despondent and cut off from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's mercy and hoping in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But when it comes to that, I think all of us, when we sit in a gathering where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's name is mentioned, where the teachings of the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam are brought into conversation, we should tune our minds to say that this is for me. Ibn Abbas radiallahu anh, really, this is actually a really interesting point. You know, there are verses in the Quran, Surah Al-Baqarah, Surah Al-Ma'idah, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is addressing the Jews and the Christians, or He's addressing the disbelievers, or He's addressing the hypocrites. Ibn Abbas radiallahu anh said that whenever I read these verses, I would keep in mind as well that these are spiritual maladies that could affect me. Right? It's important to keep in mind that we could be on the opposite spectrum. And I have, let me, just from a raise of hands, we all probably, actually forget the raise of hands, but we all know somebody who, let's say, has left the fold of Islam and they decided not to be there. I remember one person who I actually used to lead Taraweeh with, Hafiz of the Quran, knew Arabic, all that stuff, and he's no longer a Muslim. So he's decided that Islam is not the right faith, and that's basically what it is. Like, he used to be giving khutbahs, and he was an imam, and I'm not making this up. It's just, these are people that I know personally. So the mistake that I feel that, not necessarily this individual, that we tend to make, is that coming upon hidayah is a one-time effort. Like, once I've made it, I've made it. But no, there's no guarantee that we may live in that manner for the rest of our lives. There's no guarantee that who I am today, that the guidance that I have received, that I will die upon it. Hence, we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala all the time that Allahumma thabbitna inda al-mawti bi la ilaha illallah. That, oh Allah, bolster ourselves at the time of death with the kalima la ilaha illallah. In Surah Yusuf alayhi salam used to teach his family to pray, tawaffani musliman walhiqni bis salihin. Let me die as a Muslim. Let me leave this world in the state of Islam and raise me with the believers. Now, does that mean that we should be worried every single day about becoming a non-Muslim? Does that mean we should be worried about just losing our iman consistently? Maybe on one end. There's a hadith of the Messenger ﷺ where he said that a time will come where a believer will go to sleep and wake up as a disbeliever, and a disbeliever will go to sleep and wake up as a believer. How does that work? That works when we live in an environment that is constantly pushing messages of doubt, that is constantly pushing messages which are antithetical to what it means to be a Muslim. But the only way to reshape that is this cerebral reprogramming when my mind is in a state of dhikr, when my mind is able to understand and comprehend that my remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is there to remind me of the primordial pact that I made, where Allah asked me, am I not your Lord? Alastu bi rabbikum? And I responded, qalu bala, shahidna. An taqulu yawm al-qiyamati inna kunna an hadha ghafilin. Lest you come on the day of judgment and say that we were unaware of this. We didn't know. We were in the state of heedlessness. So reducing the amount of heedlessness we engage in, increasing the amount of dhikr that we are in, is what will lead us to understand and to be reminded and be in a state of perpetual awareness of the fact that when I hear the Quran, this is for me. When I hear the Quran, this is for my betterment. And I want you to think about the transformative nature. If you're sitting in a khutbah, say with your child, and you turn to your child and you point to the Imam, you know who that was for? That was for me. And you know who that was for? That was for you. Seeing how people take responsibility for their own well-being, their own spiritual Islamic well-being, has such a profound effect on young people to do the same exact thing. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Really, I mean, that's a great thing because most of us would think, Muslim community probably, since alcohol is haram, it's not going to be a problem.
Yeah.
Similarly, you being imam and knowing all the masajid, are we doing some programs for the spousal abuse and the child abuse, which is very common in our community? Are you aware of that, and should we do that in a regular manner?
Yeah, I think there was, that is something to really bring into consideration. I'm glad you brought it up. It's a sensitive topic for a lot of people, but I think we need to, on one end, the first topic you mentioned when it comes to domestic abuse, we need to have something that is able to procure for people that are going through domestic abuse who have a way to reach out. Now, there's two issues that come up. Number one, the masjid, first and foremost, is a place of prayer. It's a community center. Each community has to assess how it is that they're going to handle potential issues in the masjid. It comes down to information mining first, right? What are the issues in the community? And imams or chaplains or spiritual caregivers are very much so aware of what's going on with who and how that care can be provided. For the second issue you mentioned, for child abuse specifically, I think it's very important for communities to have clear-cut, in-stone, concrete rules of engagement for the community when it comes to protecting children. I think that it's a very, very important point to bring into conversation, especially in the current climate that we're living in, where sexual ethics are being taught in a manner which are antithetical to Islamic upbringings and Islamic ideals. Taking the bull by its horns and taking an advanced approach to this and taking a more approach that is preventative, I think is a great step to move forward on. I know that certain organizations have created codes of conduct. I'm forgetting the names from the top of my head to specifically address this issue. And I think that communities should be very much so aware of it. Obviously, it's a sensitive topic, but if you have parents, for example, who don't know how to talk to their kid to teach them how to be protected in, let's say, public environments and whatnot, then that would be something to offer, because a lot of parents don't know until it's too late. So I think the building of social programs in the masjid tend to work better when you partner with someone that's already doing the work. So I know certain masajid that I visited, they don't necessarily have a psychologist on staff, but they'll say, for example, open hours, maybe once a week, sponsor someone to come and provide mental health care that's open to the community, or by schedule, or they'll help sponsor it. Like, I know this has nothing to do with domestic abuse or child abuse, but like MCGP has the Medina Clinic, for example. They'll try to bring people who don't have health care or whatnot and, try to get help. So I think partnering with people that are doing that and creating a formal relationship to make social services accessible to people is something that many masajid should really look into and invest in. Yeah.
Any other questions? I'll ask a question. We are our intellectual tradition, as you know, is we kind of obsess over definitions, and definitions being the limits of things. What can we take from the tradition to understand what the limits of a relationship should be? Meaning, like a marriage, for example. How do you know when this will no longer work? What is that moment? Or in some kind of other collaboration, or in an organization, or in your job, something like that.
I think each individual has their own limits and boundaries that they know. And when you're finding yourself in a relationship of any nature, business, personal, whatnot, and you don't derive legitimate joy from it, you don't wake up and be like, man, this is something I have to do, and we begin to settle on the mediocre, I think that's where we need to assess, not necessarily give up, but assess the strength or weakness of that relationship. I think that's something that has to be brought into question. And to do that assessment takes courage, right? It takes boldness, it takes fortitude, and to be able to have a real talk with oneself or whoever is in that relationship paradigm is where things need to be brought into conversation. Either we can fix this or we can't. So I think that's something to bring into conversation. As for definitions, I don't think anything is clear cut in that sense. It's all about a subjective reality to each person's own experiences.
Anyone else?
Everyone's like eating the pizza. They're all like, or out. You can feel the sun setting and the lights turning off.
Assalamu alaikum. So my question is that, mashallah, we've been seeing a lot of growth throughout America in masajids. So my question is, what should be our common goal for masajids, not just interfaith necessarily, but as a holistic approach? What should be the goal of masajids in America?
What should be the goal of masajid in America? I may ask you for a follow-up. I don't think masajid throughout America should have a united goal. I think America is a very big place, and I think that each region is different. Each region has different cultures, different socioeconomic backgrounds. And I don't think that even looking at Muslim societies in which we had united caliphates, for example, when you look at the Ottomans, they didn't seek to micromanage and create goals for the entirety of the region. What they did was they would accept people and their cultures as vassal states, they would pay a tribute, and then they would basically do what they felt was best for the region. You know, I think that's the most important thing to keep in mind. You have Muslims in America, which are roughly, like 5 to 8 million Muslims, give or take. That's a ginormous number. We can't get people to put their shoes on the rack, right? We want people to now come together under like one ginormous umbrella organization. I think each masjid is going to be different. And I think we should just accept that. You will have certain masjids that just will not be able to maintain any form of leadership. You have certain masjids that will only be there for prayer. You have certain masjids that will only be there for classes. You have certain masjids in which it's going to be much more social. Right? People will critique the social masjid for, people just come to get married. I was like, great, we have a marriage crisis in America. People don't know how to meet other people. Good. You have other masjids that, it's just a hangout center for uncles from India and Pakistan. Great, so what's wrong with that? You know, at MCGP, we did the Iqbal study circle, right, where we went through Shikwa and Jawab-e-Shikwa. And some people were like, why do we need this? I said, why not? Because you have a lot of brown Muslim kids who think they're either white or black. They don't understand that there is a identity which is a South Asian American Muslim. And that's completely fine. Right? You have certain masajid in which the khutbah is Arabic. Okay, well, fine. We live in America, whatnot. Some people want to feel that cultural affiliation. And this is where when I actually look at it as an outsider, this is where I say ikhtilaf is rahmah. The differences showcase a mercy, because of the fact that people have options, right? I know growing up in North Jersey, when people ask me where I learned Arabic, I just say I learned it in North Jersey, because I could, talk to people in Arabic because there were so many people that are there. In other parts of America, outside of the East Coast, people have like this very monolithic, cultural ideal in which they don't see the rest of the world. So I think when we talk about America, what should Muslims in New Jersey do versus what should Muslims in Alaska do versus Muslims in Arizona versus Muslims in Georgia, Texas? It's different. And I think what they should do will be a product of the culture that is birthed from those people living in those communities.
Okay, I want to go back to something, to the beginning, which is what we talked about, knowledge and the challenge of community. So one of the challenges, I think, and to bring it back to the personal, you are someone who has pursued various levels of knowledge seeking of traditional sciences. I think if you hold it from here, it's better. And one of the challenges I think we have in terms of engaging with imams, scholars, is that we don't have a system like an Azhari system or another system to understand what's the difference between a brother, an ustad, an imam, a sheikh. And this is confusing to people. And then, how should we treat them? How should we pay them? What is the level of engagement? So for you, as someone who's gone down this path and chosen this as a career for yourself, what are some of the challenges that you have faced? What are some of the things that you would like to see change in terms of how we grow this class of people and protect them, take care of them, and help them become, rather than traveling from one organization to the next, have them become rooted in community and grow with the community and allow the community to help them grow and to help them grow with the community?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. This is where the crisis of authority and leadership comes into play. I have a very, very heterodox approach to this. Right? Remember how I was like, I'm conflict averse or whatever? I'm going to just go straight, into it. I think as communities, we need to completely do away with all the titles. Brother, imam, like you can have terms that are professional. Because of the fact that a lot of the terms that we have appropriated, what I like to say, are from past Muslim countries, or wherein you had Muslims that had a certain role, and that's kind of like, those terms aren't there. So for example, we don't introduce people anymore as mufassir and muhaddith. So it's like terms that have been left in the past. Even like the term imam, the imam was in the community the one that would lead the prayer as appointed by the khalifa. In this day and age that we live in, number one, always scrutinize people that you want to bring to the masjid, right? Always do a background check. Ask about them in other places, not just if you're going to hire them as an imam, but also if they're going to come speak to your community. There are so many dajjals out there, right? Deceivers, charlatans that do what? And I was reading this hadith, I think yesterday, at Darul Islah, the hadith that the end of times will be near when you have people that will come to you wearing the clothing of sheep, right? And they specifically use the word suf, especially within like a lot of Sufi traditions, not to, call out one tradition over the other, right? I think Sufis or Salafis or whatever, right? It's actually funny. When I worked in Connecticut, they were like, so are you Sufi, Salafi? Are you Jamaat Islami? Like, are you Ahl Hadith? Are you Brahmi? They're like, which one do you think are right? I'm like, they're all wrong. They're like, you got the job, right? That's what it was. But, the word that's used is suf, people that would put on really nice, soft clothing. And I've always found it weird. It's funny, my dad's like, when sometimes he'd see people show up, like wearing like a whole ton of clothing, and there's this entourage around them. He's like, he's like, what is this costume party, right? The point being, when people dress to impress and to gain followers, and if you were to investigate them or ask them a few questions, things would kind of shrivel up. The Messenger ﷺ is saying that there will be people that will come on the day of judgment who will seek to deceive people and earn this world, right, through the akhirah, right? So they will be people that will have sheepskin on them, but their hearts will be the hearts of wolves. They will seek to deceive you, and they'll deceive other people. And those are the people that you need to be very much so aware of. People who don't have communities, and somebody saw them with like a very high follower rate on like Instagram, oh, we should invite them to our community, give a lecture. But those people have not worked with community. Those people, if you were to criticize them, their followers will like attack you. Hence, my point being that when we have a standard in the community to invite somebody, the question should be, is this person qualified? Has this person studied somewhere and had graduated from an institution? Whatever their leaning is, have they graduated from an institution? Have they gone through the grit work or the grunt work to develop the grit necessary for serving in the community? It's the example I gave of the biologist, right? If somebody has no degree in biology, but they find biology really cool, you're not going to give that person a platform to speak about biology. It's only after this person has studied, practiced, published, and worked in knowledge production before we invite them to do something. Secondly, I don't think anybody that has done a 4-year degree or a 3-year degree from an Islamic university and they're 22 years old and should be an imam, right? because of the fact that I had to do that, and I knew absolutely I was not qualified. Right? I knew absolutely I was not qualified. But people need to first engage and work under the mentorship of someone else. See, Shahir is lucky because he has his dad, right? So it's a different situation. But when you get mentorship and you are in the shadow of somebody who's been doing the work for a while, it's a very different story. And then number 3, be very wary of people who, in their bios, they just list a bunch of people that they've studied with. But when you actually need to go and get a reference, none of those people know who this person is because they may have attended their Zoom lecture or they may have just showed up to their halaqah, and they use that as a means to establish themselves as an authority. So I think when we begin to become serious about who we're going to invite, that has to be the first point. The second point, which I think is really important, I was saying this, right? Get rid of all the titles, look at a person's qualification and the work that they've done, and be very socialist about it, right? If there was a way to like classify it, equalize the ground and start working your way up. What has this person done? Where has this person studied? Does he or she have references and whatnot? For me, I don't think I have a career, to be honest, right? Because I live in Turkey and every year I assess what I'm going to do. Like I like to consider myself a nomad, right? And I have a wife that signed up for this. I don't, and you're just kind of living. I honestly think after COVID, it's very tough to say where life's going to take you. Does anybody really have a 9-to-5 career where they're going to work for 30 years and retire with a pension? I don't really think so. Most people not. But I do think that as a community, when it comes to leadership, there is that crisis of authority, and each community should work to establish what their standards of community leadership looks like and the things that they find to be acceptable.
Any last questions, comments? I think, yeah. Oh, there we go.
Assalamu alaikum. And Imam Nihal, thank you so much for coming here and alhamdulillah for talking to us. It was a beautiful, beautiful talk. I just wanted to follow up on the brother's question about the goal. And I know you answered it, saying that there are different, different places, different communities. But I just wanted to ask you a more specific question. Like, I know right here where we are right now, there's 2 masjids, this one included, that just opened up and just started. The question I have is, as community members, right, who are in this community, like, what should our role be to try to make a determination of what the community center should look like? Do we sit back and wait and see what happens and then decide, like, oh, that makes sense or that doesn't make sense? Or should there be a level of engagement, and how do we decide that?
I think it's more of an art form than a technical science. I think there's going to be a little bit of planning, and then a little bit of execution, and then a precedent is going to be birthed from that. And that's going to continue until these little precedents become a larger precedent, which then ferments the culture of the community. I think it's what we were talking about at lunch. Like, it's always going to be trial, error. Okay, now we have something. Trial, error, we have something. I think I've been an imam at 4 different masjids, and that seems to be the overlying way forward. It's going to be trial, error, and then a precedent is born. So, for example, the whole lecture versus discussion thing. I had no idea how it was going to go. I didn't think people would actually engage, but in this one community, they liked that format so much that after I left, they still do that format. So it's about, in each community, realizing what is it that people are looking for, to be in constant discussion with it, and realizing that it's not going to be, we're going to do this or that, but it's going to come through, I think, trial or error. I'm being broad, yet I'm being specific because of the fact that each community sometimes assumes that the needs are the same from the other community. But each community is unique in its own way, and it's okay to say we don't know yet what it is from everyone that's there. But when we consistently engage in inviting members of the community in this what I like to say cultural production process, then I think it allows the community to organically grow. Jazakumullahu khairan to everyone for coming. For those of you that don't know, some of the projects I'm involved with are at mektabacademy.net. So if you have a chance, definitely check it out. And Jazakallah khair for inviting me once again to Al-Falah. And I pray that the community is able to blossom, that you all are blessed in the work that you do. And we are able to find ourselves in a Jannah in this community before we're able to enter into the Jannah of the hereafter. ربنا تقبل منا إنك أنت السميع العليم وتب علينا إنك أنت التواب الرحيم وصل اللهم على